I'm Gail Bormel. I work as the Acting Associate Director for Compounding in CDER's Office of Compliance in the FDA. And what I'm going to do today is talk to you about our viewpoint, the agency's viewpoint on compounding during the COVID-19 emergency response to a pandemic. And we call it the pandemic, we call it the public health emergency, so you'll hear me refer to it that way. The actions that we took in response to the pandemic began in March of this year, and they were a direct result of the supply disruptions that we were hearing about in various parts of the country. These supply disruptions at first centered on the hand sanitizers and personal protective equipment, and later it extended to drugs. Some of the drugs that were affected during the public health emergency were those used to treat hospitalized patients with COVID-19. This drug supply interruption required, in my opinion, quick response by the agency. And you'll see that as we go through my talk with the myriad of guidances that have come out. As you know, there's really no instruction manual that comes with dealing with a pandemic, and it continues to unfold across the country. So we keep seeing updates to our guidances, and we keep seeing new announcements come out. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today during my presentation. I'm going to provide sort of some very cursory background information about the compounding program, and then I really want to take a look at the compounding policy during COVID-19. We'll provide a background on some of the policies that were affected, the recently issued policy documents, including the COVID-19 guidances. And then I'll look at some of our other programs in compounding that are ongoing during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's turn to background. As probably you all know, there are two sections of the law that govern compounding. Those are Section 503A and 503B. And just as sort of a preliminary start, I'm sure all know that under Section 503A, compounders that operate under the conditions described by the section are qualified to be exempt from certain requirements of the Act, including from the new drug approval requirements, labeling with adequate direction for use, and also from CGMP requirements. In contrast, under outsourcing facilities under Section 503B of the Act are exempt from requirements, including the new drug approval requirements, the labeling with adequate directions for use, and drug supply chain security requirements. But they do remain subject to the CGMP requirements. This slide takes a look at the comparison of the different conditions under Section 503A and Section 503B. It describes some of them, of course, not all. Some of the conditions that you can see here are that compounders such as pharmacies and federal facilities that operate under Section 503A must have patient-specific prescriptions. No office stock is permitted. They're not subject to CGMPs. The states generally have day-to-day oversight and responsibilities. There's an MOU on interstate distribution of compounded drugs, restrictions on making copies of commercially available drugs, and they have fewer restrictions than bulk substances. So they have a lot of bulk substances to choose from when compounding. In contrast, under Section 503B, for outsourcers, they aren't required to obtain prescription before they provide the drugs. They are subject to CGMPs. They register with the agency. They are subject to routine FDA inspection. They are required to report adverse events. They must meet certain labeling requirements described in the statute. There are restrictions on outsourcing facilities making copies of approved drugs. There's a wholesaling prohibition, and there's also greater restrictions on the types of bulk substances that can be used to compound. So let's take a look at that at the COVID-19 policy considerations and in general our compounding policy. So let's look at the compounding policy goals. I put these 5 up here. These are our goals applicable to a compounding program both before and during COVID. You know, we're looking to address significant public health concerns. Again, our compounding policy goals are illustrated here. They provide clarification on federal law, answer questions presented by stakeholders. They decrease the regulatory burden to the extent possible without sacrificing critical public health protections. They clarify the responsibility of the agency and the state, and they provide balance to ensure access to compounded drugs with the use of FDA-approved drugs that are needed to meet a patient's medical needs. Policy considerations in this space are access, necessity, and quality. We seek policies to develop. We seek to develop policies that preserve access to compounded drugs for patients who need them. We also seek to develop policies that encourage the use of FDA-approved drugs when they meet patients' medical needs. And last, we look at quality. We want policies that help ensure that the compounded drugs that patients receive are made under appropriate quality standards. So we can take a look a little bit at the bulk provisions under Section 503A and 503B, since those have been affected by our COVID guidances. So I'll briefly go over each section of the law. Under 503A, if a drug is compounded using a bulk drug substance, the substance has to comply with the standards of an applicable USP or NF monograph it exists. If such a monograph doesn't exist, the bulk drug substance should be one that is a component of a drug approved by the agency, or if there's neither a monograph nor a substance that's a component of an FDA-approved drug, it appears on a list that's developed by the agency. We call that the 503A bulk list. And as you can see from this slide, there have been a couple of rulemakings that have started to develop the 503A bulk list, including last year on February 15th, and then more recently in September of last year, another proposed rulemaking. Then we take a look at compounding with bulk drug substances under Section 503B. Under this section, it's a very different scenario. Outsourcing facilities can only compound drugs using a bulk drug substance if the substance appears on a list established by the Secretary, identifying bulk drug substances for which there is a clinical need. And then I go through on the slide the Federal Register proposals and the final FRN. Or the drug compounded from such bulk drug substance appears on the FDA drug shortage list. And here on this slide, you see a couple of the Federal Register notices that have been issued to start evaluating bulk drug substances nominated for the 503B bulk list, including the most recent one last month that proposes to include 4 bulk drug substances to the 503B bulk list. The last policy that I want to review is the essentially a copy policies. It's also statutory provision in both 503A and 503B. Again, they're different provisions. Under 503A, a compounder does not compound regularly or inordinate amounts any drug products that are essentially copies of a commercially available drug product. And when we look at what is a copy, we look to see whether the compounded drug has the same API, the same similar or easily substitutable dosage strength, and the same route of administration. If these are all the same, then we determine whether a change was made for an identified individual patient, which would produce a significant difference for that patient as determined by the prescriber. If the answer is yes, then it would not be a copy. Under Section 503B, however, the statutory prohibition is that the drug not be essentially a copy of one or more approved drugs. And the only way that, well, I'll go through the 2 provisions. There's the identical or nearly identical, which means that you take a look at whether the compounded drug has the same API, route of administration, dosage form, strength, and excipients as the approved drug or OTC drug. And the only exception where that would not be a copy is if the approved drug is on the FDA drug shortage list. The second instance that we take a look to interpret this provision is whether the bulk drug substance that is used in a compounded drug is a component of an approved drug or an OTC drug. But it would exclude drugs for which there is a change that produces a clinical difference as determined by the practitioner between the compounded drug and the comparable approved drug. So those are, in a nutshell, the essentially a copy provisions. And they're a little different between Section 503A and 503B. And I just wanted you to be aware of it because our COVID guidances do affect the copies guidances, the prescription requirement, and also the bulk substances. So let's turn now and look at the 6 COVID-19 guidances that were either issued by the compounding program or which the compounding program had significant input into. So the first guidance includes the guidance on personal protective equipment. And in this particular case, during a public health emergency, or unless the agency withdraws the guidance, the agency does not intend to take enforcement action regarding compliance with the unsanitary conditions provision of the law when PPE supplies are unavailable, provided that the certain circumstances that are present within the guidance occur. So you'll see some of these circumstances on this slide, and I'm going to read out some of the other ones. But of course, with all of these guidances, it's really important that you go back and take a look at the full guidance. But the personal protective equipment guidance really applies only to compounders under Section 503A, the pharmacies and the federal facilities operating under this section of the law. And the circumstances that have to be present in order to have the enforcement discretion is first, the compounder is unable to obtain sufficient supplies of the PPE. The drugs that are compounded meet the conditions in Section 503A of the Act, and the compounder employs mitigation strategies that are designed to reduce the risk of product contamination, or there is terminal sterilization that's used where standard PPE is not available, provided there are some basic guarding measures taking place. The compounder should keep a record when compounding is performed without standard PPE, and keep records when there are changes in the sterilization approach and documents mitigation strategies that have been used. And basically, the mitigation strategies fall into 3 categories in the guidance, and those include strategies related to reuse of PPE or the use of inferior PPE, strategies to reduce contamination risk in the compounding area where there is no standard PPE, and strategies to reduce risk of microbial proliferation in a potentially contaminated product. So that was one of the first guidances to come out. It was actually the second one that we worked on, and was an important guidance because there were a lot of PPE shortages, if you remember, back in March of this year. The next guidance that I'm going to talk about is the COVID-19 compounding by pharmacies and federal facilities. This is one of 2 guidances that the agency issued to address the supply disruptions in drugs that were needed by hospitals to treat COVID-19 patients. And so this guidance, of course, deals with the compounders under Section 503A. And the agency said that it does not intend to take action against a pharmacy for compounding a drug that is essentially a copy of a commercially available product, or for providing the drug to a hospital without obtaining a patient-specific prescription, if the following circumstances are present and other conditions of Section 503A are met. The first is that the compounded drug product appears on the list of drugs that are used for hospitalized patients with COVID-19 that is maintained on FDA's website. I call these the Appendix A drugs because that's how they were initially referred to when we first issued the guidance, but now they're actually, there's a link in the guidance that takes you directly to our website and lists those drugs out on an FDA web page. Another circumstance that has to be present is that the compounded drug is provided to a hospital that tells the pharmacy it's treating patients with COVID-19, and the hospital has made reasonable attempts but has been unable to obtain adequate supplies of the FDA-approved drug. In addition, the hospital has been unable to obtain adequate supplies of the drug made by an outsourcing facility. And the compounded drug has to be labeled with a beyond use date that is listed in Appendix A of the guidance, except that you can use a shorter BUD if scientific literature or other information indicates that you should use a shorter beyond use date. or if you've been unable to, if the pharmacy has been unable to obtain a sufficient supply of PPE. The pharmacy also has is to mark the order with a notation that the drug is used to treat patients with COVID-19, and the pharmacy should request that the hospital provide the records to identify that the patients to whom the drugs were administered and document that such a request was made within 1 month of sending the drugs to the hospital. Probably another really important provision or circumstance in this guidance is that before the drug is sent to the hospital by the pharmacy is to notify the state authority within its state about sending the drug to the hospital, and the state has to say that it does not object. The state authorities would include the regulating authority within the state that the pharmacy is located, such as the Board of Pharmacy, and also the regulating entity in the state where the hospital is located. So if the hospital is in another state, you would notify, or the pharmacy would notify the Board of Pharmacy in the state in which the pharmacy is located and the Board of Pharmacy in the state in which the hospital is located. The last circumstance I'm going to go over is that the pharmacies are to report adverse events within 15 days of receipt of or no later than 15 days of receipt of the adverse event related to the compounded drug that was made under this guidance. The companion guidance to the one we just talked about is the COVID-19 compounding by outsourcing facilities. And again, this was a temporary enforcement discretion policy where the FDA announced it would not take action against an outsourcing facility that was making essentially a copy of an approved drug or for using a bulk drug substance that is not on the 503B bulk list. And also for not meeting certain requirements with regard to product stability and also for expiration date establishment when all of the following circumstances are present. Again, the compounded drug product appears on a list of drugs that's on our website, which I like to call the Appendix A drugs. The compounded drug product provided to the hospital is provided to a hospital that is treating COVID-19 patients, and the hospital has not been able to obtain adequate supplies of FDA-approved drugs. In addition, the outsourcing facility practices regarding stability testing and expiration dates meet the conditions in the appendices of the guidance, except that if the compounded drug is an aqueous sterile solution, the beyond use date is not more than 28 days, room temperature, or 42 days when refrigerated. And the outsourcing facility would initiate stability testing once the batch size of the product reaches 1,000 units. And the outsourcing facility uses a container closure system for which they have previous experience and data that demonstrates suitability. Of course, if the outsourcing facility has literature or other scientific information that indicates a shorter beyond use date, then the outsourcing facility should use that shorter date. In addition, the most recent update to this guidance has been that outsourcing facilities report weekly the products that they make. This is posted on our website, and it's intended to inform hospitals of the availability of compounded products available from the outsourcing facilities. And as you can see from the two guidances, the agency requires in the guidance for the Section 503A compounders that the hospitals, if they can't obtain adequate supplies of the drugs from the FDA-approved drugs, that they should turn to the outsourcing facilities. And so the preference for outsourcing facilities is due to the fact that these compounders operate under CGMP requirements. So, we have made these product reports available to the public so that they can see which outsourcing facilities are making the products. And, we are hoping that this is providing information to hospitals that are treating the COVID-19 patients. And here's the most recent list of the drugs that I like to call Appendix A. They're the same list for both compounders under Section 503A and compounders under Section 503B. They're all aqueous solutions for injection. This was last updated in July 13th to include dexamethasone, sodium phosphate. And so that's just a view of those drugs. Next, we'll turn to another guidance that the compounding program worked on, but was issued by our Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, and that is the one on repackaging and combining of propofol during COVID-19. This really addresses the shortage of propofol that has occurred during this pandemic because, as you all know, propofol has been used to help intubate patients during the pandemic. And what this guidance seeks to do is to address the circumstances under which propofol can be repackaged or combined. And this would be propofol that's used from different conventionally manufactured products. So as you can see, we look at the circumstances that are in play in this guidance, and the first circumstances is that the hospital treating the patients have made reasonable attempts to obtain the FDA-approved drugs. The repackaged or combined propofol drug is discarded if there's any change in appearance to the drug. The product is repackaged consistent with the practices in the repackaging guidance, except that the FDA propofol may be repackaged or combined without doing so under nitrogen. The beyond use date is no more than 12 hours, and in some cases, as you'll see from my bullet points up here, depending on what products you're combining, they could have a beyond use date of less than 12 hours. The container has to be suitable for the storage of the drug product through the beyond use date. The labeling should specify storage between 4 and 25 degrees Celsius and do not freeze. And then there are other circumstances, such as the drug is combined or packaged under the direct supervision of a licensed pharmacist, and the outsourcing facility is to do so under GMPs. Outsourcing facilities have to adhere to the labeling requirements, and pharmacies that do so, as well as outsourcing facilities, have to meet all state requirements. So there's a number of circumstances here, but intended to really address the shortage of propofol during COVID-19. And this is the table that's included in the guidance, and there's specific instructions about which products can be combined with one another and what the corresponding beyond use date is. So you can take a look at that. And then probably one of the most revised guidances is the alcohol-based hand sanitizer product guidances. There are 3 of them. I'm concerning myself with a compounded guidance, but there are 3 guidances reflecting the need for alcohol-based hand sanitizers. It was our first guidance that we issued back in March, and really is probably, I think, the most updated guidance. So the first thing to note about this is, that the agency, of course, said that it does not intend to take action against compounders that prepare these alcohol-based hand sanitizers for consumer use and also as healthcare personnel rub in certain circumstances. And first, the hand sanitizers have to use certain ingredients, and you can see these ingredients up here: alcohol or isopropyl alcohol, glycerin, hydrogen peroxide, and sterile distilled water or boiled cold water. The alcohol is denatured either by the alcohol producer or at the point of production of the sanitizer product. And then the finished hand sanitizer is prepared according to the formula that's here on the slide. This is the actual formula that is to be used to produce these alcohol-based hand sanitizers. We are asking that the compounders pay particular attention to the ethanol, i.e. alcohol or isopropyl alcohol that's used, to make sure it's the correct ingredient. And the latest update, which I'll talk about on another slide, is that if a compounder accepts ethanol or isopropyl alcohol from another source, it has to be tested to ensure that the methanol content of the alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, is no more than 630 parts per million. In addition, the hand sanitizer is to be produced as an aqueous solution. It's labeled consistent with the labeling in the appendices of this particular guidance. And in addition, state licensed pharmacies, federal facilities, and outsourcing facilities are to report adverse events to the agency. So what's happened recently with alcohol-based hand sanitizer products? Well, beginning in June and through July and August, the agency has been warning the public not to use certain hand sanitizers because they have been found to contain methanol or wood alcohol and 1-propanol. These are both toxic. Methanol is toxic when absorbed through the skin, as well as life-threatening when ingested. 1-propanol is also toxic and can be life-threatening when ingested. The agency has a very nice website, which I encourage you to look at, which lists the detailed listing of the manufacturers, the distributors, and the name of the hand sanitizer drug products for which there have been found to be issues such as methanol contamination, 1-propanol contamination, microbial contamination, subpotency, et cetera. And of course, this is important because some of these products have been imported, and people may not be aware that they're problematic. So I encourage you to look at the website and take a look and review it. In addition to the efforts of the agency to put this information on our website, we of course updated the hand sanitizer guidance to include methanol testing, and that's what came out on August 7th. And then I'll talk a little bit about the USP compendial updates, which are also important in this area. So if we take a look at our alcohol-based hand sanitizer, the same one we went over about 2 slides ago, the update specifically is to tell compounders, as well as other entities that are using alcohol, isopropyl alcohol from another source, that they need to test each lot of the active ingredient for methanol content. The compounders can use a laboratory to test if they don't do so themselves. The agency strongly recommends a lab that has been inspected by FDA and is in compliance with CGMP. And again, alcohol or isopropyl alcohol containing more than 630 ppm of methanol is not consistent with the temporary policy. It renders the product adulterated. And if you find this, it's contaminated, you should destroy the active pharmaceutical ingredients API and contact the agency. In addition to the guidance and to our webpage updating the issues with various hand sanitizers, the agency also reached out to USP to talk about revising the monographs to include in the identification section of the alcohol and dehydrated alcohol the methanol testing. So currently, under the USP monograph, the methanol testing component is in the impurity section, but we have requested that this test be moved to the identification section because under the GMP regulations, it would require that manufacturers of drug products detect and quantify methanol present for each lot of alcohol received. And the USP has stated and issued a notice of intent to revise these 2 monographs. It will become official September 1st, so in about 2 weeks. And again, it will be the methanol test requirement, but in the identification section. This has been done previously by the agency when we found that diethylene glycol had been found in various components such as glycerin and sucrose, et cetera, throughout the world. And it's really an important measure to keep the public safe from contaminated, adulterated drugs. The last guidance that I'm going to talk about that was issued during this pandemic involves the post-marketing adverse event reporting for medical products and dietary supplements during a pandemic. And it provides recommendation to the industry about mandatory reporting requirements that may not be feasible during this time period. It does clarify that adverse events associated with drugs compounded or repackaged by an outsourcing facility should continue to be reported during the pandemic. And reporting is deemed to be needed during this time because we have an increased production of compounded drugs during a pandemic, including during COVID-19, and it's a relatively new industry. And this is the adverse event reporting is already required by statute for the outsourcing facilities, and so there was no need really to not have the reporting occur. If you have questions on these guidances, here are the links. There's a hand sanitizer guidance mailbox. Please send questions related to this mailbox. If you have questions about the methanol contamination, it's the same mailbox, just put methanol in the subject line. For the Propofol guidance, this would go to OPQ inquiries, and here is the mailing address there. And for all other guidances, please send them to our compounding mailbox at compounding@fda.hhs.gov. So now we're going to turn a little bit to other compounding programs during COVID-19, because we do have programs other than policy programs. We have our inspection program, our stakeholder outreach, and our Center for Excellence. So generally in our inspection program, we focus our oversight on entities whose practice have the greatest impact on public health. We oversee the outsourcing facility sector. They register with us, and we have the whole Section 503B that's relatively new to review, to evaluate their compliance with the law. We also, as part of our inspections, we encourage voluntary compliance, and we do pursue regulatory action when needed. We also conduct risk-based oversight of entities that are not outsourcing facilities, but that would engage in multi-state, large-volume distribution of compounded drugs. And so that's another focused oversight for the agency. But in general, the agency does not intend to engage, nor does it engage in routine surveillance of state licensed pharmacies that operate within their state. So this just goes over, it goes over the types of compounding inspections the agency has. We have 4 cause, surveillance, and follow-up. 4 cause is what it sounds like. We would inspect a facility because there have been reports of serious adverse events or product quality or facility concerns or other complaints. We conduct surveillance inspection, which could be an initial inspection of the outsourcing facility or could be a risk-based surveillance of another compounder. And we also do follow-up inspections to follow up on corrective actions that were implemented after a prior FDA inspection or regulatory action. So what's been going on with these inspections during COVID? Well, as you might have seen in March, the agency announced that it had postponed most foreign inspections, and we had also postponed all domestic routine surveillance inspections. So there was not a lot going on with inspections between March and July. There was an announcement in July that the agency was starting to resume domestic inspections, guided by a new risk assessment system. So we are optimizing operations and new work arrangements, and we are looking at the CDC guidance to inform efforts related to workplace exposures to COVID-19 in non-healthcare settings. In addition, another important point about this resumption of domestic inspections is that the agency has developed a rating system to determine when and where it is safe to conduct a prioritized domestic inspection. And so if you want more information about the resumption of the domestic inspections, I encourage you to view the website and take a look and see what's going on with that. So we're back resuming inspections now in this 5 months after the initial postponement. So that's what's going on during the COVID-19 pandemic right now in August. In addition to inspections and policy, we also continue our stakeholder engagement. We welcome stakeholders' views regarding our policies and oversight on compounding. I speak with a lot of people routinely. Especially during the pandemic, we spoke to a lot of stakeholders about what was going on in various parts of the country. In addition to sort of the pandemic discussions, we've also held annual stakeholder listening meetings, and this year was no exception. We just had them virtually. And we also hold intergovernmental meetings, which, again, this year during COVID-19 will be virtual. We welcome submission of specific recommendations or policy proposals, and we also welcome questions and requests for guidance on ways to comply with the statutory requirements. There's still a lot of work ahead on compounding, and it does continue. The last thing I wanted to turn my attention to was the Compounding Quality Center of Excellence. This is a program that was initiated in last year, and we've been working on it. It is intended to offer extensive training on CGMP practice for outsourcing facilities and entities that wish to become outsourcing facilities to really help bolster the sector and to make sure that we improve the quality of compounded drugs. This was designed to be in-person trainings, and we have switched over to all virtual instructor-led trainings. We also have a component of the program that is self-guided and provides web-based trainings. We also engage in in-depth market analysis to describe the current and future market for outsourcing facilities, including market barriers. And we also have an end-of-year conference to bring together outsourcing facilities, the agency, and other stakeholders. So this was the vision of what the COE would be this year, and we are making good on this vision. We just are tweaking a couple of things because of the pandemic. So the first tweak you can see is we now have virtual instructor-led courses planned for the remainder of this fiscal year, and I think we rolled them out in July. We have a couple more training programs in environmental monitoring, sterile drug compounding, investigations in CAPA, and clean room that will be this month and next month in September. So we've managed to sort of shift gears from in-person to virtual, which many people are doing during the pandemic. In addition, we have self-guided web-based trainings. Only the first one, the regulatory framework for human drug compounding, is live, but we expect another 5 trainings to be on our website, and you can see the topics, and these can be taken at your own pace. And last, the Compounding Quality Center of Excellence. We are hosting a conference in September 20th to 21st of this year. It will be virtual. And so it's really a great opportunity for the outsourcing facility community to get together and learn from expert speakers, to dialogue with the FDA, hear about current policies related to compounding. And so I encourage you to register if you have not done so already. Registration is ongoing. And so I thank you very much for your attention. I know it's a lot of information. I try to really focus on what's been going on during the pandemic. Compounding remains an agency priority. The policy, the inspections, the engagement with stakeholders, and the COE are integral parts of our program. They've continued during the pandemic. We welcome your feedback and stakeholder input. So with that, I thank everyone.